to me, what's the dog not barking here is our Secretary of State. Anthony Blinken is essentially playing Dick Cheney's game and saying, oh, no, well, see, we don't talk to evildoers or something.
President Biden's gaffes. Last week, he uttered the words New World Order at an address to the Business Roundtable. And then a few days later, the gaffe that was heard around the world, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power, referring, of course, to Vladimir Putin. Are these really gaffes, or are they trial balloons for some kind of new foreign policy from the United States? I'm Addison Wiggin. These are the Wiggin Sessions. Today, we're joined by Scott Horton, director of the Libertarian Institute and editorial director of Antiwar.com. Scott is also the author of Fool's Errand and Enough Already. We'll talk to Scott in a moment about his work. But in the meantime, let me just welcome you. Thanks, Scott, for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so tell me your story. You're at the Libertarian Institute and also editorial director of the Antiwar.com. I've been reading articles from Antiwar for years. Tell me your story a little bit and tell me about the books too.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just basically an anti-government extremist type from Austin, Texas. I grew up not liking the Republicans or the Democrats. And let's see, Waco was burnt to the ground when I was 15. And well, anyway, I'm a Ron Paul guy from the mid-90s on a Harry Brown and a Ron Paul libertarian. And then ever since the terror war started, which I saw coming in advance, I started palling around with the guys at Antiwar.com, which was mainly Justin Raimondo was their main writer there. But of course, the great Alan Bach, the late Alan Bach, and Justin's now dead too, of the Orange County Register, and Matt Barganier, and they had so many great writers at Antiwar.com at the time. So, Justin, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Justin Raimondo, but he was absolutely the most important writer in America during the W. Bush years. He just had insight into what was really going on in the inside of the push for war with Iraq and all of that, just far and above anybody else and before and all of that. So then I was also a pirate radio guy. Started out as a talk radio caller and ended up doing my own show starting in about 1998. My first interviews were of a surviving Branch Davidian named David Thibodeau in 98 and 99. And then I really started my current interview show right at this time, March of 2003. And, I guess it was April, it was early April 2003, right when Baghdad was falling. It was 3 days after the Saddam statue was pulled down in Baghdad and the occupation began. And so, and my first interview was Alan Bach from Antiwar.com. So then I became assistant editor and was just Raimondo's editor and Link Monkey for about 10 years there. And I've done about 5,000, almost 5,700 interviews since 2003, and almost all on foreign policy. So that's kind of been my comparative advantage in the thing, is as an interview host. And then in 2016 and 17, I wrote this book. It started out as Enough Already, which is a chapter on each of the terror wars, basically. But then chapter 2, Afghanistan, I just got bogged down and the thing got out of control. And so I wrote a book about Afghanistan, and that became Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. That came out in August of 17. And then I went back to the drawing board and finished the whole book, Enough Already, which is essentially all of the Middle East wars from Jimmy Carter all the way through the end of the Donald Trump administration.
And then you host also the Scott Horton podcast, which is you delve into the ideas behind the books.
Yeah.
And that's where you conducted some.
Oh, and then also you mentioned the Institute. I founded the Institute with Will Grigg and Sheldon Richman in 2016. And then sadly, Will died in the spring of 2017. But he's still our leading light in many ways. But it's me and Sheldon, and we got a whole great crew of guys there now, and churning out great podcasts and articles on, especially foreign policy, but a lot of libertarian everything else too. So
yeah, I know Sheldon from my time writing the Daily Reckoning.
Oh yeah,
a few times. Yeah,
he's one of the all-time great libertarians, no question about it. Oh, and we publish books too, besides mine, and we have a lot more coming out this year. So
great. Well, I'll make sure that we get people to take a look. But let's begin our conversation. Let's begin with the obvious. We're now in month 2 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've written a lot about the subject. You've written a lot about the subject. There's propaganda on both sides. That's kind of, the first thing that the first casualty of war is the truth, right? From your perspective, this is an important question, I believe, to kick things off. What are the American public missing in the conversation? We know that the Western narrative is dominant in the mainstream press. It's very difficult to figure out what the Russians are even up to if you just have that kind of channel of information. Mm-hmm. But if you take the cynical or even the practical view that we're spewing propaganda as well, what is it that what do you think the most important thing that Americans are missing right now?
Well, in terms of what is actually happening on the ground here, there, and the other places, I think on the minutia, you should disbelieve any little piece of it from any side that you hear. There's no reason to believe in it. In the larger sense, is the battle map mostly accurate from the various think tanks and whoever are putting out these maps of where the different engagements are happening and where, which side's troops control what territory and that kind of thing? I think generally speaking, those things are right. If that's, the part of the war that you're following. To me, what's the dog not barking here is our Secretary of State. Antony Blinken is essentially playing Dick Cheney's game and saying, oh no, well, see, we don't talk to evildoers or something. I don't even know if he's making that excuse. He's just not talking to Sergei Lavrov. As we're recording this, it's March the 30th. It's been fully 6 weeks. It's been since February the 15th that our Secretary of State has talked to Sergei Lavrov. And we're talking about a proxy war between the United States and Russia on Russia's border, and one where there are continuing calls for the American naval air forces and our regular air forces to intervene in this war against Russia. And so in my estimation, this is essentially some of the, comparable anyway to the greatest treason in the history of our country or even the world. That, for the foreign ministers of these powers to be staying home and not figuring out a way to work this out and bring a ceasefire as soon as absolutely possible is treason against us all. And the Russians, they play their part too. But if Antony Blinken was in Geneva saying, come on, man, I'm trying to negotiate in good faith. Where are you, Sergei? Sergei would show up. They could hammer this out if the Americans were willing to try. And you had the French president on the phone, but the French don't have the weight the Americans have. The Americans can overrule the French. The French signed the Minsk II deal, but the Minsk II deal isn't a thing unless America tells Kiev to implement it, right? So that lesson's learned. And what are we doing? I have to tell you, this is still within the realm of speculation, but it's educated guesses here, not just shooting in the dark. It very much looks to me like the Americans have decided they want to prolong this war. Now, I got to tell you, I don't have any real reason to believe that they preferred that Russia invade Ukraine. There are plenty of indications, of course, from the last 6 months that they wanted very much for Russia not to invade Ukraine, that they told Putin 10,000 times, you better not invade Ukraine. At the same time, though, they were not willing to negotiate in good faith and come up with a reasonable solution to ensure that he would not invade Ukraine. It was just a bunch of you better not. And at the same time, they were doing things to ratchet up tensions, including continuing to pour in arms and signing new declarations of partnership with Ukraine And, you know, there are a few other provocations, but one of the main ones was Zelensky. And maybe he said this off the cuff. We don't know. Maybe they put him up to it. But Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference in February said, yeah, you know, geez, if everybody else is breaking the Budapest Memorandum, where everybody promised to leave us alone if we gave up our nukes, if everybody else is breaking it, maybe we'll just break it too. Well, so what did Putin do? In his declaration of war, he literally said, at least according to the translation I read, oh, now he wants nukes, weapons of mass destruction, echoing W. Bush's argument there. Now, in one sense, that's him just mocking America for breaking the law whenever America feels like breaking the law. If we can't get the UN to do it, we'll just get NATO to do it, like Clinton in Serbia and Kosovo in '99. And hell, if we can't even get NATO to do it because the French and the Germans are begging us not to, well, we'll just get a coalition of the willing and invade whoever we feel like, you know, like we did in Iraq War II. And so he also invoked genocide, supposedly, against the people of the Donbass, which is a hoax, but obviously playing off of Bill Clinton's hoax of the fake genocide in Kosovo that he invoked, claimed 100,000 Kosovar civilians had been slaughtered by the Serbs before launching that war, which was just as illusory as Saddam Hussein's H-bomb program. This is completely ridiculous. And I think now, I'm sorry, real quick here. They told the New York Times, Admiral Stavridis, he would have been Hillary's Secretary of Defense. Talks a lot. You're familiar with this bald head from the TV. If you see him, you'll go, oh, that guy, Admiral Stavridis. So he was blabbing his big mouth in the New York Times, and I shouldn't talk about the hair patterns here. He was bragging in the New York Times in December that essentially, okay, look, plan A is you better not invade. Don't stop. Come back. Please don't. But if you do invade, well, don't we have a surprise in store for you? And that's going to be, as he put it blatantly, and as his student Hillary Clinton blabbed herself on MSNBC just a few weeks back, that we're going to replicate Ronald Reagan's war for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It'll be Rambo 3 all over again. And as they've said a couple of different times, you know what? We might not know the first thing about how to defeat an insurgency, but we sure know how to back one, like we did in Afghanistan and like we did in Syria. And pardon me for moralizing here on your show for just a second, but these people got the word Afghanistan in their mouth just now only half a year after we finished losing that war that we fought for 20 years against the direct consequences of our previous intervention there on behalf of the Mujahideen terrorists that we supported against the Reds in the 1980s. Hillary Clinton laughed this off on MSNBC. Yeah, there were some unintended consequences from that. But anyway, it worked great for driving the Russians out of Afghanistan and helping break their economy and all these things. She just laughed it off. And I have to say, this isn't just some lady. This is Bill Clinton's wife. And remember, when they were first inaugurated into power, Gore was the vice president, but Hillary was the co-president. They called him Billary, and she was riding shotgun on all this. Well, when they were in power for just a month and a week, 2 days before they raided the Branch Davidians, was the first real Al-Qaeda attack in America. As Egyptian Islamic Jihad tried to blow up the World Trade Center. They almost succeeded in toppling one World Trade Center tower over into the other, broken at the bottom, falling over into the other and knocking them both down. They could have killed 30,000 people in a late afternoon. Are you kidding me? And from that moment on, what did Bill Clinton do? Throughout the 1990s, he continued to back the Mujahideen. No matter when they blew up the Khobar Towers, attacked our guys in Saudi Arabia at the National Guard, training there. They blew up our embassies. They attacked the coal. And the whole time, what's Bill Clinton doing? He's backing the Mujahideen in Bosnia. He's backing the Mujahideen in Kosovo. And he even backed the Mujahideen in Chechnya in the Second Chechen War in 99-2000. CIA worked with the Saudis to back the bin Ladenite terrorists there. And so then Hillary became a senator, where she did whatever George W. Bush wanted, including vote for Iraq War II, which turned all of Western Iraq into Al-Qaeda University for, 8 years, where then she became a Secretary of State under Barack Obama, where they took Al-Qaeda's side in Libya and Syria. The same guys that went to Iraq to get their PhD at Al-Qaeda University, they came home to Libya and Syria, where America lied with them. because the Saudis hated Gaddafi more just for personal reasons, and because America and Israel and the rest hate the Shiites more in Syria. So then they fought this horrific, dirty war in Syria that led to the rise of the caliphate and Iraq War III from 2014 through 17, also, of course, taking place in eastern Syria, where another at least 500,000 people were slaughtered by the Al-Qaeda guys, their Islamic State rivals, the Americans who came in finally to crush this monster that they had built. And these Democrats want to brag right now that, yes, see, we're so clever. What we want to do is we want to replicate Reagan's war in the 80s in Afghanistan, and we want to replicate the Syrian dirty war. Hillary's wants to brag about this dirty war that led directly to the caliphate in Iraq War III. And she just wants to laugh that off like it doesn't mean anything. Oh, she also, by the way, did the coup d'etat in Yemen that led directly to the worst stage of the war that's going on in Yemen now, where, again, America has been fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda ever since 2015, now 7 years straight. So Hillary Clinton, this person who laughs the entire terror war off, 30 years of terrorist war against us, 20 years of our wars against and for them, that she has been intimately involved in every single stage of this whole time, personally, making the bad calls, laughs off as a few unintended consequences with a giggle and a shrug, and continues on. And that's what we want to do to the Russians in Ukraine right now. You can watch her rant on MSNBC. It's beautiful. It's just, I mean, for what it is, it's just insane.
That was my next question as you were talking about that. Like, put it in context of Putin is obviously watching all of this, and he sees the different iterations of foreign policy coming through. And to put it in context of the way I opened the show, that's like the subtext of what goes on, what the American people see, what I see. When I was trying to like figure out what Putin's speeches really meant, it's hard to figure out what their motives are. But the subtext of the ongoing wars, the war on terror, and now we have sort of like the World Economic Forum countries versus the autocratic countries of the East. That's the way we've been phrasing it. How is it possible? Like, during that entire time, mostly what the Western, like the average person that's just like, why are we at war in Ukraine? Or we're not technically at war, but maybe we are. Like, it's just confusing. And the narrative is that Putin's a bad guy. But there's such a huge subtext to all of that. And that's really what I want to get at. And that's why I asked, what are the average American media watchers, what are they missing? And they seem to be missing this larger, I don't know, some people want to call it the Cold War II or whatever, but there's a larger real politic that's going on between Russia and the United States, and then China's like hanging out in the wings, waiting to see what happens.
The great comic Dave Smith, my good friend, he has this bit where he talked about the origins of September 11th. He goes, and then people would say, come on, man, we've been bombing them for 10 years before September 11th. And then people say, what? Well, that doesn't sound like us, right? And then he goes, yeah, well, but think hard about it. Bill Clinton was bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi from 10 years, wasn't he? And people go, yeah, I guess actually that does kind of ring a bell, yeah. Maybe I wasn't putting it at the height of importance in my life, but it could have been important to somebody. I guess I could concede that, right? So it's the same sort of thing here. Well, gee, as far as I know, America hasn't done anything in Eastern Europe. Yeah, well, but how far as far as you know, go, right? I mean, you got to at least be interested and wonder. If TV says that history began the day before yesterday, does that really sound right? And in fact, just think of the context that we're talking about here. America versus who? America versus Russia? Not the USSR, not the Soviet Communist Union that ruled a third of the world, and including all of Eastern Europe up to halfway across Germany, right? And was armed with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons and had this declared, open hostility to the United States and back again, in that vicious circle through the whole Cold War era, from the end of the Second World War through 1989. All that's over. And everybody knows, everybody's mom and everybody's dad knows. There used to be two superpowers. Now there is one superpower, right? That's not libertarian foreign policy critique theory. That's not like commie critical theory, nothing. That's everybody's narrative. Everybody knows that. That's what happened. There were two, and then the Soviet Union fell all the way the F apart to the point that it does not exist at all. And last Christmas Day was the 30th anniversary of the final end of the USSR, and the red flag came down and the red, white, and blue flag went up in its place. And we've been friends with them ever since, right? So it can't be that the problem here is that Russia is the other superpower in the world and they're picking a fight with us and they're threatening to conquer all of our friends in Europe if we don't stop them and all of that. Because we just know that what's left of the USSR in the form of the Russian Federation is just no such power. As David Stockman says, their entire GDP is the same as Manhattan Island. You're not allowed to count Staten Island or Brooklyn or Queens, because then now your chart doesn't match up anymore. And so they have no pretension at global power. What's happening here is America, the unchallenged global superpower itself, has taken the last 30 years since the USSR dissolved to extend its political and military empire to the four corners of the earth as far as they possibly can, to the ultimate degree. And that was the point of the invasion of the entire Middle East, is, to try to achieve this sort of permanent state of hegemony over that very important region, for, obviously for energy reasons and weapon sales to Israel and other things like, and other allies there, among other things. And and frankly, that has everything to do with the Cold War that you could argue never stopped. The Russians have their own oil resources, but the Chinese really don't. American hegemony over the Middle East has always been justified for the last 30 years, at least from time to time. You see in very powerful quarters that the purpose of American hegemony over the Middle East is not to guarantee cheap oil prices for the American people or anything like that. It's so we can cut off the Chinese in the event of a global contest with them, which is ridiculous because our Navy could sink or even just threaten any oil tanker on the planet and stop them from delivering to China if it came down to it. They have no Navy that can compare to ours in the Indian Ocean or anything like that. If it came down to it, I'm not saying, I'm being descriptive, not normative here. I'm a non-interventionist, you understand. But anyway, that's what it's all about is, in fact, Donald Trump complained, why are we even doing this in the Middle East? Why are we protecting oil that's all going to China? And we're providing their security on the high seas. Does that sound right to you? But the thing is, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is we can cut them off, or that's, supposed to be part of the point of it. So it's always kind of been great power conflict all along. And now sorry, I'm rambling so much. To get to your real point, Bush Sr. promised Gorbachev, not just, hey, I won't expand NATO east. Everybody's heard that. He promised Gorbachev, if you dissolve the Warsaw Pact, if you set Germany free and Poland free and Hungary free and Czechoslovakia free, if you set the Baltics free, if you get the hell out of all of Eastern Europe back to inside the borders of Russia itself, we promise not to expand NATO east. That was a big promise. Yeah. And, my friend Daryl Cooper likes to point out that they lied to us for years. Oh, that never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. It was not in writing and all this obfuscation. Well, guess what? The Russians were in the room. It was a solemn promise when they heard it, regardless of what the Democrats and the Republicans try to spin ever since then about it, So then Clinton comes in, Clinton expands NATO. He launches two relatively major wars against the Serbs in Bosnia in 94, 95, and then against Serbia again in the Kosovo War of 1999. And I'm sure you're much more familiar with this story than me, probably. would be Larry Summers and the Harvard boys who were sent over by Bill Clinton in the 1990s to do the shock therapy and privatize the Russian economy, except they deliberately did it in such a way to destroy the Russian economy, to kick them while they were down, not to give them a prosperous free market capitalism, but to hyperinflate their currency and destroy it. And then through schemes, these foreign financed vouchers and loans for shares programs that turned the entire Russian economy over to a few gangsters who absolutely just ruined it. And life expectancy across the country just plummeted. It was an absolute catastrophe. And then again, as I said, Clinton backed the Mujahideen in Bosnia, Kosovo, and in Chechnya. And in the Chechnya war, this is where Putin came to power. He was put in charge of the Chechen war by Yeltsin. And then after he won it, Yeltsin named him prime minister. And then when he resigned on New Year's Day 99 or New Year's Eve 99, 2000, he named Putin to replace him as president. And he's been more or less in power ever since as president. So that was a direct consequence of those policies of the Clinton years right there that got us to there. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm just coming forward to the Western narrative.
Yeah.
As veneer thin as it is that Putin is I don't know, the words that come out of President Biden's mouth are hard to believe, but that he's a butcher and that he's a dictator hell-bent on recreating the Russian Empire or the tentacles that the USSR had when they were in full Cold War mode, Warsaw Pact and all that.
Well, I know, just like, David Koresh and his people are about to march on downtown Waco.
Exactly.
And
so
it's
like we pride ourselves on nation building, but we also pride ourselves on creating enemies that don't really exist. And if we take your view that or even what you had quoted David Stockman on saying that their entire economy is the size of Manhattan's in digits, right? It's really just it's propaganda on our side. And I get a lot of crap for saying stuff like this in our own e-letters and our editorial, but that's part of my goal, is to show that you know, each argument is flawed, and that's my goal in talking to you. Also, you're anti-war,
look, I mean, there's kernels of truth in that, right? Like Putin has long lamented the fall of the Soviet Union, not in the sense that he misses the communist totalitarian dictatorship, but in the sense that it was the Russian Empire. And when it fell apart, they lost a lot of access to power and money and influence and resources and whatever else. But worst of all, they left ethnic Russians behind, many of whom had been moved into these states during the days of the Soviet Union. And then all at once, poof, it ceased to exist. And these people are left behind without the protection of Mother Russia. Well, as long as they're safe and snug and sound in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, and nobody's hurting them, and they're being treated as first-class citizens, then it's fine. Nobody thinks that, and Putin wouldn't have an argument inside his own government for we need to start a war with Lithuania in the name of protecting the ethnic Russians there. That would be the.
Well, they began the whole effort in 2014 when they went into Crimea, and the argument.
Well, that's right, but look at the context there, right? The context is the Americans overthrew the government, the elected government in Ukraine, and the first thing that new junta did was threaten to kick the Russians out of their all year round warm water port at Sevastopol, which the Crimean Peninsula has belonged to the Russians since 1783, and it had only been given to the Ukrainians by Nikita Khrushchev in 1954, when it didn't matter because they were all answerable to the Kremlin anyway. It was just a bribe to the Ukrainian Communist Party to support his rise to power after Stalin. But we're talking about the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, like his word is gospel or something, when the reality was it was always a super majority population, Russian population there. And the reality was that the status quo, where the Ukrainians keep Crimea, but the Russians lease a base from them, had held for 23 years with no problem since the end of the Cold War. It was only after Obama overthrew the government in Ukraine for the second time in 10 years. The first one was Bush's Orange Revolution of 2004. Obama did it the second time in 10 years, and then they threatened to kick the Russians right out of that naval base. Only then did they seize the Crimean Peninsula. And then the war broke out in the East because the people who had supported the government that the Americans overthrew said, well, if you guys can just seize government buildings in a street putsch, then we can just seize government buildings and refuse to recognize your authority since you overthrew our elected president.
Yeah,
And then Kiev waged a war against them. They called it a war on terrorism and invaded the East. So to your point, 15,000 ethnic Russians in the Donbass have been killed, mostly in 2014 and 15, but in what they call low-level fighting ever since then. So when Putin says there's a genocide going on there, he might be mocking Bill Clinton's, invoking, also exaggerating using that term in order to launch the Kosovo war. But what he's also doing is he's making a substantive claim that these ethnic Russians who were left behind on the other side of the line in Ukraine need our help. They're being killed, and they literally are being killed. So in other words, he might have like his own Mein Kampf fantasy. Everybody says that he's, the mental student or even slave, I guess, of this philosopher, Alexander Dugin, who says that, no, we need to make Russia great again. But again, to the point about the gross domestic product and their actual ability to, wage that kind of power over other people's countries and weighing that against the necessity of doing so, you just don't see a case for Putin. And look, and he's been in power for 22 years. There just isn't a case that he's always been bent all along on recreating the Russian Empire, even where you find these large populations of ethnic Russians, much less the Soviet Union, conquering Poland and conquering Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Germany and all that. That's absolutely preposterous. And especially if you look at what just happened, what's been happening in this war. Does anybody think they're rolling into Berlin next? Come on,
To what extent? All right, so I want to kind of veer off of the actual conflict and talk about the State Department and the sort of what we like to call the deep state of the industrial military complex.
Let me stop you right there, because this goes to where we left off a second ago. When Bill Clinton was expanding NATO in the 90s, all of the grayest graybeards from the Council on Foreign Relations, all of the wisest American grand strategists said, don't do this. This was not their project. And I think Brzezinski might have been for it, but Kissinger was against it. Brent Scowcroft, H.W. Bush's right-hand man, closest confidant and friend and co-author of his memoirs, was against it. George Kennan, who had essentially coined the containment policy against the Soviet Union and inaugurated the Cold War in the 1940s, and his rival Paul Nitze, who favored rollback of the Soviet Union. Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the war in Vietnam under Lyndon Johnson, and just on and on. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a neoconservative hawk, and even Richard Pipes and Edward Luttwak, who were hardcore. I think Luttwak was a neocon, former leftist turned rightist, but Richard Pipes, I don't believe, was ever a leftist. He was a hardcore right-wing anti-communist, anti-Soviet ideologue. All of these guys said, whoa, 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 the Soviet Union is gone. We don't want to expand our military alliance into the former Warsaw Pact states. The Russians are going to take that as a massive provocation. They might decide to scrap the nuclear treaties and rearm. They might react in a terrible way. We should definitely not do this. So what happened? Where you were just going with that question, Lockheed intervened, and Lockheed poured a ton of money into this thing they called the Committee to Expand NATO, the Committee for NATO Expansion. They kind of changed the name a couple times. But anyway, it was a guy from Bruce Jackson from Lockheed. And he would just buy thick steaks and cocaine and prostitutes for senators until they all just got on board with this thing. This is what we're doing now. This is the new consensus. And you just hire a bunch of eggheads to write a bunch of studies. And it's all just a racket to get rid of Lockheed products, to get rid of fighter jets. Of course, you join NATO, you got to standardize your military to all of our specifications, which means either, the country in question has to buy this stuff, or the American people have to buy it for them. Right. And so that was the whole thing, was a racket in the first place. Then On top of that, you do have this ideology of American exceptionalism where, I mean, they really do. You notice this. They really do believe their own BS about how innocent they are and how their violence is at worst ever a mistake. But even then, the other guy always started it and they were only ever defending themselves. And they always have the highest minded goals and all this stuff. So they look, starting with the Clinton era, through W. Bush and through Obama, they look at the idea of spreading NATO into Eastern Europe. Well, they rationalize to themselves that we're just spreading peace and security. This is not a threat to Russia. I don't know how many times they said, this isn't about Russia. We're not doing this to threaten Russia. All we're doing is we're just spreading Pax Americana. Just like they keep the peace between Kansas and Nebraska, they're going to keep the peace between the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Slovenia and Hungary and Moldova. And we'll just make sure nobody ever scraps because they're all part of our integrated military alliance. Same for Germany and France. They used to fight a lot. We don't want them to fight anymore, do we? The Poles definitely don't want. If they're going to be armed, the Poles, we want them to be part of our Pax Americana, our military structure, not just a European army, but a European army dominated by the United States of America, NATO, right? Except that if you're on the other side of the line, sitting in Moscow, this whole thing sure looks like a knife right at your throat, to paraphrase Putin from his declaration of war. That he said, these guys, if they install their missiles in Ukraine, if they succeed in bringing Ukraine into NATO and start putting their missiles in the way they've done in these other countries, he started ticking off the flight times from Kharkiv to Moscow. That boy, for one of their, ballistic missiles, it would take 15 minutes to get to Moscow. For one of their Tomahawk cruise missiles, 10. And for if they put hypersonics in Kharkiv, they could hit Moscow in 5 minutes. He said, that's like a knife at our throat. And to rewind a bit, Oliver Stone interviewed Putin in 2016. And at one point he says something like, come on, Vlad, you know this whole thing is just a racket. They're just ripping off the American taxpayer to dump all the money into this boondoggle, this missile defense boondoggle. But these missiles don't even work anyway. The whole thing is stupid. And so you should relax. And Putin says, hey, listen, Oliver Stone, I understand American economics. And I think you're probably right that these anti-missile missiles, they may not even work. They're definitely very expensive for a reason. What am I, a dummy? Sure. But look at the position you put me in, Oliver Stone. I'm the head of security here.
Yeah.
You're ringing my country with anti-missile missiles. So what do I got? What am I going to do? I got to build more missiles, don't I, Oliver Stone? I can't let you just tear up the anti-ballistic missile treaty. That's W. Bush tore it up. I can't let you just tear up this treaty and ring my country with anti-missile missiles and not respond. You're arms racing me. I got to arms race you back. Homeboy, what? And not again, I swear, look, I'm a Texan, man. I'm not trying to take this guy's side, but I'm just saying this is going back to Yeltsin in 1996. Yeltsin and then Putin have essentially begged us for 25 years. Please don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Man, you're threatening our security. You're making us real nervous. You say that you're not pointing a spear at us, but it sure looks like you're pointing a spear at us. And man, we keep expressing our security concerns and you keep seeming to not take into account our security concerns. You know what I mean? They just keep saying it over and over and over in a way where you got to admit, and I guess this is where I'll leave this part of it. If you look at what Putin said in those speeches that you mentioned there, the February 21st and February 24th declarations of war against Ukraine, that everything he says in there is rational. And I'm not saying it's reasonable as an excuse to invade Ukraine. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. And I think I have no idea what all options he had, but he certainly had other options than to invade. There's no way I'm justifying what he did. But I'm saying when he says, I did this for the following litany of reasons, if you're a grown-ass man, you cannot help but to take those words seriously. This is not, oh, yeah, he's, rant. In fact, I brought up David Koresh before. David Koresh honestly meant for you to hold your horses until he's done writing his interpretation of the seals. And when he's done, he's coming out. That sounds crazy. And yet it was extremely rational to him. If you were being fair, you understand this is important. He's going to finish and then we'll move on to the next stage from there. What they do, they launched the assault before he could finish the damn SEALs, right? It's the same thing here. Only here, we're not even talking about the 7 SEALs. Here, we're talking about, geez, you guys are trying to bring Ukraine into a military alliance right on our border. And we're treating that like he's more unreasonable than David Koresh. You know, when David Koresh was being reasonable about some fanciful stuff, this guy's being unreasonable about some very reasonable concerns, you know, or rational concerns. You know what I mean? So now I heard someone say he could have just turned off all the gas to Europe until the UN and blackmailed the UN Security Council into passing a resolution putting Indian peacekeepers in the Donbass to enforce, and a new resolution to enforce Minsk to whatever, something, right? He could have done something other than invade. And that's only just one idea I saw on Twitter. I probably should think real hard and ask some real experts what other options he could have had. But there could have been very many, right? I'm not saying whatsoever that what he did was right or justifiable in a moral sense. But all I am saying is that it is just a fact that Bill Clinton, W. Bush, Barack Obama, and yes, even Donald Trump, and especially Joe Biden, who Joe Biden, just like Hillary Clinton, has been riding shotgun on this policy all along. He was a senator who supported NATO expansion under Clinton and under Bush. He was riding shotgun as vice president during Barack Obama, when he literally, we know for a fact, was involved in the coup in Kiev in February 2014. His son, of course, and their politics was all tied up in Trump being impeached for temporarily holding up an arms deal to Ukraine, if you could believe that. And then now as president, he came in and immediately ratcheted up naval and air exercises near Russia's borders, poured an extra $1 billion worth of weapons in on top of the $2 billion Trump had already put in there. And as we went through the litany there of all of the ways that they escalated and then refused to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this thing. So that's it, right? What Putin did was wrong, but he did it within the context of the new Cold War between the United States and Russia that was begun and deliberately implemented by the leaders of the United States of America over the last 25 years.
What role do you think that the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, play in supporting and even egging on the current administration? And I include people like Klaus Schwab and Mark Carney and
man, I'll just turn that question around on you and you tell me. I mean, clearly they're in a position now where, you know, as you talked about, like Europe is and Russia are now more divorced than they have been at any time in the last 30 years. The pipeline is dead. Russia's being pushed to China. They're threatening that they won't sell hydrocarbons to anybody without rubles starting very soon here. And all of these things, I have believed for a long time that the high watermark of the American empire was in 2003, and that everything has been downhill since George W. Bush blew our wad in invading Iraq in the way he did. But in terms of what this war means for those changes in the growth of multipolarism around the world and the maybe the end of American dollar hegemony and the rise of these new trading blocs and how their wealth and power compares to America's and Europe and all those things, I'll ask you to please tell me, man, what do you think about that? What do you think that the Davos crowd, they wanted to kick Russia out of Europe and towards China? Or were they thinking of what they were doing here really carefully at all, or what?
It certainly goes back to unintended consequences. And it's also just a large degree of hubris. When we enact the sanctions, we believe that we're still acting unilaterally. But then if Russia sells more oil to China because they need it and they sell it in rubles, that's good for them. That's good for the ruble. And if China starts buying oil directly from Saudi Arabia in yuan, that's good for them, and also undermines the petrodollar, which has been, supporting the dollar since the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. So I think it's a very bad miscalculation of the power of sanctions in the financial war that came out of the invasion. But to me, all the political stuff that you've been describing leading up to Putin's position has been enlightening for me, just because it's very difficult without actually digging into the history of it to understand, the amount of violence that is going on right now. But it's been a subtext for we're going on 3 generations now, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing of it is, like I was talking about with Hillary and Biden's responsibility, and I'm not trying to just pick on the Democrats. I mean, it's been the consensus this whole time. It was Gingrich and Lott that were just as guilty as Clinton in the 90s and pushing the whole thing. But hell, what was I going to say there? I started thinking about how much I hate Republicans too, and I got
you got too excited.
I know what it was. Is that so there's this whole thing, as I was saying, there's this whole argument about how, look, we're just spreading peace, and this isn't supposed to be against Russia, and how the Russians are supposed to just accept that, and yet here's the real wrinkle in that whole narrative: is they keep overthrowing every government that's friendly with Russia and that doesn't want to join our alliance. Yeah. So I mentioned Ukraine twice in 10 years, but they also did the same stunt in Serbia. They did it in Georgia. They tried in Belarus twice now, including just a couple of years ago. They tried again. I mean, where Belarus is. And you think Ukraine is important to Russia. Belarus has got to be the most important, so-called foreign nation, which is clearly under their dominance now, that the Americans would dare to not just try, but to try again to overthrow the government in Belarus. I know a guy who's a guy named Lyle Goldstein, who was formerly at the Naval War College, this brilliant military analyst. And I asked him, Putin could have taken the Donbass back in 2015. Why did he wait? Or 2014? Why did he wait till now? Or what changed his mind? And he says, well, I think it wasn't just Putin. He says, I think when they tried to overthrow the government in Belarus a couple years ago, or a year and a half ago, that just set off all the alarm bells in all of the national security state in Moscow, that the Americans are just relentless and they will stop at nothing. And we have got to draw the line somewhere. Come on, Vlad, what the hell are you going to do about this now? And I think, and I guess what I was going to say about the Democrats was how they're so involved, Biden and Hillary. None of them can accept their role, their responsibility in making things the way they are. If you and I were just, I Dream a Genie in power up there, we could just say, screw W. Bush and Joe Biden. They don't know what the hell they're doing. We got a whole new policy now, right? Wiggins and Horton's policy. We're going to work this out, right? But they're so gay married to their own stupid past mistakes, right? They can't ever just say, okay, yeah, we overreached a little bit with that last coup, right? Maybe the last couple. And so all they got to do then, as you said in your introduction here, they have to change the narrative to something else. And the only thing they've got is Putin is evil. And so he does bad things because that's what evil people do, is bad things. And there's no history behind this. The guy just woke up. It was an unprovoked attack, as they say, which is, literally true in the very narrow sense, but not exactly true in the broader sense, right? And they just, as John Mearsheimer says, and I kind of disagree with this, as I say about the color revolutions, I think they were really targeting Russia anyway, getting rid of anybody in Russia's favor that they could. They even overthrew the government in Kyrgyzstan in 2005 for a little while there. But John Mearsheimer, the realist professor from the University of Chicago, he says, in his study of this, and he is, after all, the dean of the realist school, he says he doesn't believe that it was ever about Russia until the aftermath of the coup of 2014. Then once Putin reacted by seizing Crimea, and then the war broke out in the east, and then Russian, deniable operator types came across to help the separatists fend off the Kiev attack and all that. Well, then they needed a narrative. And the narrative couldn't be that, well, geez, when we overthrew the government in Kiev a couple of weeks ago, we thought we'd get away with it scot-free, but oops, it kind of turned out that there was something Putin could do about it after all. They can't say that. That might be the grown-up thing to do, but they cannot say that. So instead they say Putin is evil, Putin is bad. And this was like their real break with him. And one thing I'll add to, which I think there must be something to this. I don't know a whole lot about it, but there's this really interesting writer named Richard Hanania, and he's at Defense Priorities. And he's like a right-wing anti-war guy, essentially. He's half anti-woke stuff and half anti-war stuff. And I really like his analysis. And he wrote this essay about how in 2015, and this is the kind of thing that would just go right over my head at the time. I think I barely noticed when this was a controversy, but Putin passed a law that made it illegal to propagandize for homosexuality to minors. Now, I don't know exactly what the law said or exactly how it was applied, but I'll tell you, according to Richard Hanania here, I think the way he wrote it, he was in graduate school at, I think, Georgetown Foreign Policy School at the time, something like that. So he was just up to his eyeballs in Hillary Clinton Democrats who are going to go make their career at the State Department after this kind of people. And he said that to them, this made Putin worse than Hitler. This made Putin like 10, 15 clicks to the right of Pat Buchanan. This made him just absolutely the devil. And the epitome, because see, they vanquished the American conservatives, right? Who's left? Pat Robertson or something? Like there are no American fundamentalist Christians in the dominant culture anymore at all for them to rail against. So here's Putin, is a powerful, essentially conservative. He's not like a far right nationalist or fascist. He's a conservative. And I'm, all things considered, good and bad by that, but just meaning he's, culturally, he's the perfect boogeyman for them. And then Hanania even writes that at the time there was that Kevin Spacey TV show, The House of Cards. And in The House of Cards, he said there was a plot that year where the president of America and Russia hammer out a peace deal for Israel and Palestine. And the poor Palestinians are finally going to get an independent state. And then the president of Russia passes this anti-gay law. And then President Kevin Spacey scotches the Middle East peace deal. And the Palestinians get screwed again because it would just be unthinkable that the American, and they're like not even being ironic about this, apparently, in the way this is portrayed in the season. That like it's not even lamentable that, the poor Palestinians got screwed over some PC virtue signaling crap. But instead, it was like, yes, of course, they had to be sacrificed. What are we going to do? We're going to shake hands with a guy who passes a law against pro-gay propaganda, whatever it was. So this, in other words, they just taken their American culture war and they just put it on Putin. And they just made him the epitome of the American culture war. Then, like 1 year later, is the Russiagate hoax. And now here's the thing about you. You never believed in that crap for a second. And you probably saw through it and you probably debunked it for all your friends for 3 years straight and more, right? But so that's a problem because not that you're wrong. The problem is it makes it too hard for you to really put yourself in the shoes of these Ford Explorer driving, NPR listening, Hillary Clinton voting women who believed in that story, and the men too, for that matter, who believed in that story. Pretend for a moment that you were a Democrat and that you really, really, really did believe and just absolutely were terrified that Donald Trump represented nothing like the conservatism of the Republican Party you've ever heard of, but was literally a Nazi fascist white supremacist who meant to abolish the FBI and replace it with the SA, and who was going to overthrow the Constitution, turn America into a fascist dictatorship, and he was all going to do it with the sponsorship of the Kremlin, who overthrew the election, hacked the voting machines, rigged the whole thing, and prevented Hillary Clinton from taking her rightful throne, and instead installed this neo-Nazi white supremacist, lunatic, crazy man, Donald Trump, in power. You would be really afraid if you really, really believe that. And the point being that we have to understand just how really, really afraid the Democrats of this country were that story was really true. And just think what it would take for them to get over it, or to get over their absolutely just unhinged, irrational fear of Vladimir Putin and the extent of his power to change our lives, to dictate to us. I mean, that would have been Well, it was only a Hollywood movie. It was ridiculous. You know, people were accused of being spies inside the U.S. government. I mean, when the John Birchers said that Ike Eisenhower was an agent of the communist conspiracy, people were like, that's stupid. And that was it. Nobody believed that. That's stupid. Ike Eisenhower, he's an agent of the Rockefellers, not an agent of the Kremlin, dummy. Right? And then that was it. You can't even come up with a time where someone accused a president of the United States of being a traitor under the control of the Kremlin, of all the preposterous things. But because it was so preposterous for you and me, it makes it difficult for us to then really put ourselves in the shoes of those who really were that afraid. And they're not over it yet. And the fact that Robert Mueller didn't indict anyone for that so-called collusion doesn't really affect them at all. They're still, that feeling of fear of Russia under Putin is essentially the same as the way right-wingers felt about Stalin in the late 40s and early 50s. It's just total panic.
Yeah. Yeah, and that contributes to the sway that a speech like Biden gave in Poland, where if you listen to people, they're like, oh, that's like Reagan standing at the Berlin Wall and saying, tear this wall down. They're likening his rhetoric to that. I mean, and of course, Reagan's was blown out of proportion as well. But It is interesting to see that there is a ready and willing audience. And that's just a fascinating thing about doing Zoomcasts, and you're doing your podcast and even just writing on a daily basis about these things, is that people are self-selecting what they believe in and what they don't. And if you get, what did you call them? The Ford Explorer driving NPR soccer moms, right?
Yeah.
If you get them, if you try to speak any reason to them, they don't think very deeply about it. They just have an emotional response, and they just choose what they believe. And that's also what they say, the Trump loving conservatives are doing. They're just choosing one side over another. I just find it fascinating because we don't have a controlled press. We don't have 3 networks telling the same story every night. We have a wide open discourse based social media now, and people just kind of instead of sort of consuming the narrative that we're used to, like as I was growing up, as you were growing up, there was like kind of one story that was being told about the Cold War and that kind of thing. Now we have multi narratives.
Yeah, you just choose your own adventure,
ever
right?
talk to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I noticed this really starting in the Bush years, where you read some right-wing blogs and some left-wing blogs, and they're totally criticizing each other.
Yeah.
But neither of them are acknowledging what the other guy said at all. And you can tell it's not that they're omitting it. It's that they have no idea what the other side is saying about them, because they're not looking at what the other side is saying about them. They're just talking about the other side. And you see this, I mean, on TV, it makes it more blatant, where like on the Hannity show, the liberals say this, the liberals say that. But they never show a clip of a liberal actually saying that. Or I guess sometimes they do. But usually you only hear about the other side from what your own side says about the other side's point of view, which is always, the easiest thing to knock down would be your own characterization. So, and I'm not picking on the right. The liberals and the left are exactly the same way. In fact, I think it's one of our advantages as being libertarians. You see this with Ron Paul too, even when he was a member of the Republican Party. He was always just him up there. He caucused with them, but he was always on his own up there as a nonpartisan type. And as libertarians, we just don't have that much invested in the Republican or the Democrat narrative, that we wouldn't like, or that for some reason we would fear contradicting them or something like that, right? There's just no reason to do that. We can say what we feel like.
Yeah.
And I'm late, Addison. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I just want to tell you one thing. When Ron Paul was still in office, he used to host the Liberty Caucus, and I used to go down there. Sometimes you just go down to sit in the room while other people were talking. But I presented a few times, and it was mostly Republicans that would show up, and they were just incredulous. They thought like libertarian ideals where you didn't support one party or the other they were like a cult and not to be listened to, or at least suspicious of. Anyway, well, let me just say, Scott, thank you for joining me. I was going to ask you what individual investors should do in an environment like this, but I'll take that up in my own writing. And
yeah, that one's on you. I don't have any money, so I wouldn't know what to do with it. But thank you so much for having me, man. It's been great to talk to you.
Yep. Good to talk to you too. Thanks. Bye.
You'll have a great one.